A shiver ran through Elias's spine as the cold metal floor vibrated beneath him. His head throbbed, and the harsh glare of overhead lights blurred his vision. The muffled sounds of panicked voices reached his ears, a mix of terror and confusion. He flexed his fingers, feeling the tight constraints of bindings around his wrists. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself to sit up, every muscle protesting against the movement. A quick scan of the room revealed a dozen others in various states of shock and distress. Some were crying, others struggling against their restraints. All shared the same blank, terrified look. Elias took a deep breath, pushing aside the pain radiating from his leg, the injury that had branded him as weak in the eyes of his captors. They were on a ship, that much was clear. The Zavranis, an advanced species known for their twisted sense of sport, were transporting them. No, him and the others were merely cargo, prey for their perverse game. Elias's lips twitched into a grim smile. They had no idea what they had brought on board. A heavy clang echoed through the chamber as a door at the far end slid open. The Zavranis entered, their tall, lithe figures cloaked in dark armor that gleamed under the harsh lights. Their eyes, cold and predatory, scanned the room, lingering on each captive with an almost clinical interest. One of them, the leader by the way the others deferred to him, stepped forward. "Welcome, creatures of Earth," he said, his voice amplified through a device strapped to his throat. "You have been chosen to participate in an event most prestigious. An honor, really, to be selected as prey for the hunt." A murmur of confusion rippled through the captives, but Elias remained silent, his gaze locked on the speaker. The leader's lips curled into a cruel smile, obviously enjoying the fear emanating from his audience. "You will be released onto one of our prime hunting grounds, a planet designed to test every facet of your feeble abilities. Survive for 24 hours, and you will earn the right to continue living. Fail, and your remains will serve as a reminder of our species' dominance." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Elias noticed how the leader's gaze seemed to linger on him, eyes narrowing slightly. Did he suspect something? No, the Zavranis were arrogant, confident in their superiority. To them, Elias was just another broken soldier, a challenge, perhaps, but not a threat. Not yet. The captives were unceremoniously yanked to their feet and marched out of the chamber, down a series of narrow corridors. Elias limped slightly, his injured legs slowing his pace. He forced himself to focus, every step a reminder of his purpose. This was not a random abduction. He was here for a reason, and he had to make every second count. The corridor opened into a large hangar, the floor vibrating beneath the thrumming engines of sleek Zavrani's ships. Elias's eyes darted around, taking in every detail, the layout, the positioning of guards, the locations of exits. Everything would be useful later. The captives were loaded into separate pods, their restraints finally removed. Elias rubbed his wrists, the skin raw and tender. A panel slid shut in front of him, and the pod jolted as it detached from the ship. Through the small viewport, he could see the dense, green canopy of a jungle planet below. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with anticipation. This was it, the moment everything began. The pod crashed through the atmosphere, rattling violently as it descended. Elias braced himself, muscles tensed, ready for the impact. When it came, it was brutal, the force throwing him against the harness. He grunted, pain flaring through his leg, but there was no time to dwell on it. The pod door hissed open, revealing a dense jungle stretching out in all directions. Elias stumbled out, breathing in the humid, alien air. The sounds of unfamiliar creatures echoed through the trees, and the ground beneath him was soft, almost spongy. He took a moment to assess his surroundings, noting the thick underbrush and towering trees that would offer both cover and concealment. He moved quickly, knowing that the hunt had already begun. His first priority was to secure a defensible position, somewhere he could observe and plan. The Zavranis would expect panic, chaos. They thrived on it. But Elias was not like the others. He had been trained for situations like this, to turn the environment into an advantage. He found a narrow ravine with steep walls covered in thick vines and dense foliage. It provided limited visibility from above, and the rocky terrain would make it difficult for anyone to sneak up on him. Elias began setting up rudimentary traps, using sharpened sticks and vines as snares. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As he worked, his mind drifted back to the mission briefing. Intercepted Zavrani's communications had revealed their hunting expeditions, the abductions, the slaughter. It had taken months to track their patterns, to identify the next target. And Elias, despite his injury, had volunteered. He wasn't the best shot or the fastest runner anymore, but he was something else, something that made him dangerous in ways the Zavranis couldn't comprehend. He paused, listening. The jungle was alive with movement, but something felt off. He crouched low, muscles coiled, eyes scanning the foliage. A shadow flickered in the corner of his vision, something fast, too fluid to be a natural predator. Elias tensed, his hand brushing against the hilt of a crude knife he'd fashioned from a broken piece of his pod. The shadow moved again, closer this time. Elias held his breath, every nerve on edge. He could see it now, a Zavrani's hunter, its form shimmering as it activated a cloaking device. They were testing him, gauging his reaction. A slow smile spread across his face. He'd been waiting for this. The hunter stepped forward, the shimmer fading as it prepared to strike. But Elias was already moving, his knife flashing in a tight arc. The blade connected, slicing through the exposed joint of the hunter's armor. The Zavranis let out a hiss of pain, stumbling back. Elias didn't hesitate, driving the blade deeper, twisting it until the creature collapsed, twitching, onto the ground. He crouched beside the dying hunter, his voice low and steady. "You thought we were just prey." He yanked the knife free, wiping the blood on his tattered clothes. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." Elias stripped the hunter of its weapons and communicator, his mind racing with possibilities. He glanced at the sky, where he knew the Zavrani's ship hovered, watching. They would come for him now, but that was the plan. Let them come. As he melted into the shadows of the jungle, he could almost feel their eyes on him, the anticipation in the air. They were starting to realize what they had done, and by the time they truly understood, it would be too late. Somewhere high above, Veritha's eyes narrowed as he watched the scene unfold. He leaned forward, a flicker of something unsettling crossing his face. For the first time, the hunter felt the stirrings of fear. A surge of adrenaline coursed through Elias as he moved through the dense jungle, the fallen Zavrani's hunter's weapons now strapped to his back. The communicator he'd taken crackled with static, bursts of alien language and garbled orders spilling through. They were looking for him. Elias smirked, the thrill of the hunt rising in his chest. They were on his trail, but they had no idea just how close he was. He found a narrow path between massive roots that twisted like the sinews of a giant's arm, weaving a natural labyrinth. The ground was slick with moisture, the air thick with the pungent aroma of alien flora. Strange sounds echoed through the dense foliage, the cries of distant creatures, the rustle of unseen predators. Every sense was heightened, his mind a razor's edge as he navigated the terrain. The Zavranis were systematic hunters, relying on advanced technology and overwhelming force. Elias had seen them dismantle resistance before, once, when he and his team had intercepted a faint distress call from a distant outpost. By the time they'd arrived, it had been too late. The Zavranis had moved on, leaving only devastation in their wake. He'd sworn then that he would never let humanity be seen as easy prey again. A distant roar shattered his thoughts. He crouched low, peering through the thick underbrush. A Zavrani's hunter, much larger than the last, was advancing down the path, its armor reflecting the dim light filtering through the canopy. A pack of smaller, dog-like creatures flanked it, their sleek forms moving with predatory grace. Elias's grip tightened around the alien weapon. This was different. The creature was moving slowly, cautiously, its head swiveling as if expecting an ambush. They were learning, adapting to his tactics. It was impressive, he had to admit, but it also made them more dangerous. He considered his options, weighing the risks. He could engage, try to take out the hunter and its pack, but that would alert the others. No, he needed to draw them in, isolate them. The communicator at his side crackled again, and a thought struck him, a way to turn their own coordination against them. Keeping low, he activated the device, mimicking the voice patterns he'd overheard. Sector 3, movement detected. Coordinates 459.32. His voice was steady, authoritative. He glanced at the crude map he'd sketched earlier, sending them on a path that would lead them right into one of his traps. The response was immediate. The hunter halted, barking commands to its pack, then veered off the path, heading toward the coordinates Elias had provided. He watched them go, the pack's howls fading into the distance, and allowed himself a small smile. One less threat to worry about for now. Moving deeper into the jungle, Elias began to set up a series of traps. They were primitive, relying on the natural resources around him, sharpened stakes hidden under a thin layer of foliage, a makeshift tripwire rigged to a heavy branch. Each trap was a calculated risk, a gamble that would buy him time and keep the hunters off balance. He worked quickly, his mind focused, blocking out the pain in his leg and the fatigue creeping into his limbs. This wasn't just about survival. He needed to send a message, to show these creatures that humanity would not be broken so easily. A sudden sound, a faint clicking, almost imperceptible, caught his attention. He froze, his heart pounding. The sound was familiar, a memory from another life. Sniper fire. Instinct took over, and he dropped to the ground just as a searing beam of energy cut through the air where his head had been. He rolled to the side, coming up behind the trunk of a massive tree, his breathing harsh in the silence that followed. They'd brought in a sharpshooter, someone methodical enough to track him through the chaos. Elias cursed under his breath. They were adapting faster than he'd anticipated. He peered around the trunk, scanning the dense foliage. A glint of metal caught his eye, a distant silhouette perched high in the trees, barely visible among the shadows. Elias knew he couldn't stay in one place for long. He had to keep moving, force them to react to him. He bolted from cover, weaving through the trees in a zigzag pattern, his feet pounding against the wet ground. Another shot rang out, slicing through a branch inches from his head. He ducked, his mind racing. If he could get the sniper to move, to chase him, it would give him the opening he needed. He sprinted through the underbrush, his body screaming in protest as he pushed himself harder, faster. The sniper was good, too good. Every shot was closer than the last, forcing him to twist and turn, each near miss a reminder of how close death was. But Elias wasn't just running. He was leading the sniper, pulling him toward a narrow ravine he'd spotted earlier. It was risky, but if he could time it right, it would give him the advantage he needed. The ground sloped sharply, the trees thinning as he neared the edge of the ravine. He slid down the incline, gravel and dirt kicking up around him. A shot tore through his shoulder, sending a jolt of pain through his body. He bit back a scream, staggering as he reached the bottom. Blood seeped through his fingers as he pressed a hand to the wound, his vision blurring. The sniper had followed, moving with an eerie precision. Elias could see the outline of the figure now, crouched at the top of the ravine, lining up the final shot. He forced himself to stand, every movement agony, and stumbled backward, drawing the sniper's focus. The ground beneath him shifted, a trap he'd set earlier. The sniper fired, but the shot went wide as the ground gave way, sending Elias tumbling into a hidden crevice. He hit the bottom hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. Above, the sniper cursed, the sound echoing through the ravine. Elias lay still, fighting to stay conscious. He could hear the sniper moving, the crunch of boots on loose gravel. He reached out, his hand brushing against something cold and metallic, the communicator he'd taken from the first hunter. His fingers fumbled with the device, each movement a struggle. He activated it, his voice a hoarse whisper. Sector 4, requesting backup. He forced himself to sound calm, authoritative. Sniper engaged. Need immediate support. He barely finished the sentence before he blacked out, the pain and exhaustion overwhelming him. The last thing he heard was the distant roar of engines overhead, the sound of Zavrani's ships descending. They were coming for him, just as he'd planned. But he wasn't sure he'd be conscious when they arrived. Elias awoke to the acrid smell of smoke and the harsh, flickering light of a burning forest. His entire body throbbed, the pain in his shoulder radiating down his arm with every shallow breath. He blinked, forcing himself to focus. The jungle canopy above was shrouded in thick black smoke, and the air was filled with the chaotic cries of alien creatures fleeing the encroaching flames. The communicator was still clutched in his hand, the metal slick with blood. He rolled onto his back, gasping as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body. His vision swam, but he forced himself to sit up, to take stock. He was still in the crevice where he'd fallen, partially hidden by the rocks. Above, the sky was crisscrossed with Zavrani's ships, their dark hulls reflecting the orange glow of the fires below. He pushed himself to his feet, leaning against the rough stone wall for support. His head was pounding, and every muscle felt like it had been torn apart and sewn back together. He gritted his teeth, shoving the pain down into a dark corner of his mind. He didn't have time to be weak. Not now. He staggered to the edge of the crevice, peering out at the devastation. The Zavranis had set the jungle ablaze, likely in an attempt to flush him out. They didn't care about the collateral damage, the scorched earth, the fleeing animals. All that mattered to them was the hunt. A flicker of movement caught his eye. He squinted, focusing through the haze of smoke. A group of Zavrani's hunters were advancing through the burning trees, their weapons drawn. Leading them was Vareth, his imposing figure unmistakable even at a distance. Elias felt a surge of hatred, the raw emotion sharpening his senses. Vareth was here. The architect of this entire twisted game, the one who had orchestrated countless hunts across the galaxy, who had turned sentient beings into sport. Elias's hand tightened around the hilt of his knife. It would be so easy to rush out, to confront Vareth head-on. But that would be suicide, and Elias wasn't ready to die. Not yet. He had to be smart, had to think like the soldier he once was. This wasn't about revenge, at least, not entirely. He needed to complete his mission, to gather as much information as possible about the Zavrani's hunting operations and send it back to Earth. The fleet in orbit was waiting for his signal, ready to strike. But first, he had to survive long enough to send it. He slipped deeper into the shadows, moving as quietly as he could manage. His mind raced, formulating a plan. He needed to get closer to their command posts, to find a way to tap into their communications. If he could broadcast a distress signal, it would draw the attention of the human fleet. The Zavranis would be too distracted dealing with the assault to notice a lone human slipping through their ranks. Elias moved through the burning jungle like a ghost, keeping to the underbrush and avoiding open areas. The flames cast eerie shadows across the twisted trees, the heat pressing against his skin like a living thing. He could hear the hunters nearby, their guttural voices barking commands. They were searching for him, sweeping the area methodically. He needed to move faster. He came upon a clearing, the ground scorched and blackened. In the center stood a Zavrani's command module, its sleek, angular design incongruous against the backdrop of devastation. A handful of hunters guarded it, their attention focused outward, searching for any sign of movement. Elias crouched at the edge of the clearing, his heart hammering in his chest. This was his chance. If he could get inside, access their systems, he could send the signal. But he was outnumbered, outgunned, and barely standing. He'd have to be quick, precise. He studied the hunters' movements, noting the patterns in their patrols. His eyes drifted to the command module's exterior, spotting a narrow maintenance hatch on the far side. It was a long shot, but it was his only option. He waited until the nearest hunter turned away, then sprinted across the clearing, his feet barely touching the ground. The effort sent fresh pain lancing through his shoulder, but he pushed through it, his mind focused on the goal. He reached the hatch, fingers scrambling for the release mechanism. It popped open with a soft hiss, and he slipped inside, pulling the panel shut behind him. The interior of the module was cramped, filled with glowing screens and intricate machinery. Elias's eyes scanned the unfamiliar controls, his brain working to make sense of the alien technology. He needed to find the communications array, to send out the signal. He moved carefully, his movements deliberate despite the urgency burning in his veins. Each step felt like a battle, his body screaming for rest, but he ignored it. He had to keep going. He had to finish this. He found the array in the back of the module, a complex console bristling with controls. He reached for the interface, his hands trembling. He'd studied Zavrani's technology for months, but using it in the field was another matter entirely. One mistake, one wrong input, and he could alert every hunter in the area to his presence. His fingers danced over the controls, entering the override codes he'd memorized. The console blinked, then flashed green. He exhaled slowly, relief flooding through him. He was in. He began to transmit, sending out a burst of data that would ping the human fleet in orbit. His message was short, urgent. Coordinates locked. Begin assault on signal. Disrupt hunting grid. Prepare for resistance. He paused, his hand hovering over the transmit button. He thought of the other captives scattered across the planet, unaware of the impending attack. If the fleet struck without warning, they would be caught in the crossfire. He gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He needed to give them a chance to escape, to get clear before the assault began. But how? He couldn't reach them directly, not without blowing his cover. He glanced at the console, an idea forming. He keyed into the command network, accessing the hunter's tactical feeds. A few keystrokes, and the module's speakers crackled to life, broadcasting his voice across the grid. Attention all units, this is command. Immediate evacuation order. The prey have armed traps near the western perimeter. Pull back to safe distance. He cut the transmission, his heart pounding. It was a gamble, but if even a few of the hunters took the bait, it might buy the captives time to escape. He hit the transmit button, sending the signal to the fleet. There was no turning back now. He turned to leave, but froze as the hatch hissed open. Varys stood in the doorway, his massive frame filling the small space. His eyes glowed with a cold, dangerous light, his mouth twisting into a smile that was all teeth. Well, well, Varys purred, his voice dripping with menace. The little prey has teeth after all. Elias's heart raced, his mind scrambling for options. He was cornered, wounded, and facing one of the most dangerous beings he'd ever encountered. He forced himself to stand tall, meeting Vertha's gaze with defiant resolve. I'm full of surprises, he said, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. He shifted his weight, his hand brushing against the control panel. He knew he was outmatched, but he wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. Vareth took a step closer, the air between them crackling with tension. You've been a thorn in my side for long enough, he growled. But this ends now. The sound of his own ragged breathing brought Elias back to consciousness. His body screamed in agony, a brutal reminder that he was still alive. He blinked against the darkness, the taste of blood thick in his mouth. Pain flared through his shoulder, sharp and unrelenting, but he forced himself to move, rolling onto his side. The ground beneath him was scorched, still warm from the blast. The jungle around him was a smoldering wasteland, the trees reduced to charred husks. He could barely make out the wreckage of the command module, its twisted metal frame glowing softly in the dying embers. He had no idea how long he had been unconscious. Minutes? Hours? The last thing he remembered was the roar of the explosion and the searing heat as he'd thrown himself clear. Now, his ears rang with a dull, persistent buzz, and every inch of his body ached with a bone-deep exhaustion. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up onto his knees. He had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of Vareth. If the Zavrani's commander had survived the blast, and Elias had no doubt that he had, then he'd be on the hunt, angrier and more dangerous than ever. Gritting his teeth, Elias staggered to his feet. His legs wobbled, but he stayed upright, sheer willpower driving him forward. He glanced around, assessing the damage. The flames had mostly died down, leaving behind a landscape of ash and ruin. The acrid smell of smoke clung to everything, thick and suffocating. But beyond the destruction, there was silence. No sign of movement, no sign of pursuit. Maybe, just maybe, he bought himself some time. He stumbled forward, his thoughts sluggish and disjointed. He needed to find cover, someplace to regroup and tend to his injuries. But more than that, he needed to finish what he'd started. He'd sent the signal to the human fleet, but he had no way of knowing if they'd received it, no way of knowing if help was on the way. And now, with the command module destroyed, he had no way of contacting them again. A flicker of doubt wormed its way into his mind, but he shoved it down, refusing to give in to despair. He couldn't afford to doubt himself, not now. Not when everything was riding on his shoulders. He made his way through the burned-out jungle, each step a battle against the pain threatening to drag him under. His vision blurred, his thoughts fragmented. He knew he was running on fumes, his body pushed beyond its limits. But he kept moving, driven by a grim determination that bordered on madness. He didn't know how long he walked before he found the stream. The water was murky, tinted a sickly green by the alien vegetation, but he didn't care. He collapsed at the edge, scooping handfuls of the cool liquid to his lips. It tasted bitter, but it was wet, and it soothed the raw, burning dryness in his throat. He washed the blood from his hands and face, wincing as the water stung the cuts and scrapes. His shoulder was a mess, the skin around the wound swollen and angry. He needed medical attention, needed something to stave off infection, but he had nothing. Just the clothes on his back and the knife at his belt. And a single, desperate hope that the fleet had received his message. He leaned back against a rock, his eyes closing for just a moment. He could feel his body shutting down, could feel the exhaustion dragging him into unconsciousness. But he couldn't sleep. Not yet. If he stopped now, he might never wake up again. His thoughts drifted, unbidden, to the faces of the people he'd left behind. Friends. Family. The men and women who had fought and died to protect humanity. He thought of his team, of the mission that had gone so horribly wrong, of the guilt that gnawed at him like a cancer. He had to finish this. Had to make it right. A rustle in the underbrush snapped him back to the present. His eyes flew open, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached for his knife, forcing his body to move despite the agony that flared with every breath. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and imposing. For a split second, Elias thought it was Vareth, and a cold dread gripped his heart. But then the figure stepped into the light, and he saw that it wasn't a Zavrani's hunter. It was a human. The man wore a battered tactical vest, his face smeared with dirt and sweat. His eyes widened in shock as he spotted Elias, and for a heartbeat, they simply stared at each other, both too stunned to speak. Elias? The man's voice was hoarse, disbelieving. Is it really you? Elias struggled to his feet, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. Who are you? He rasped, his voice barely a whisper. It's Carter, the man said, stepping closer. We were in the same unit back on Mars. You God, we thought you were dead. Elias blinked, trying to make sense of the words. Carter. He remembered the name, remembered the face, but it felt like a lifetime ago. What are you doing here? Search and rescue, Carter said, glancing around nervously. After your signal came through, the fleet sent down a team to extract survivors. We've been looking for you. Relief surged through Elias, nearly knocking him off his feet. He'd done it. They'd gotten his message. But the feeling was short-lived, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. We need to move, he said, his voice stronger now. Vareth is still out there. He won't stop until he finds me. Carter nodded, his expression grim. We've got a rendezvous point a few clicks north. The others are waiting there. We can get you out. Elias shook his head. I'm not leaving. Not yet. Carter stared at him, disbelief etched on his face. Are you insane? You're injured, half dead, and there's a Zavrani's commander hunting you down. You need to get to safety. There's no safety, Elias said quietly. Not as long as they're out there, hunting us. I need to finish this, Carter. I need to stop him. For a long moment, Carter said nothing. Then he nodded, his jaw set in determination. All right. What's the plan? Elias felt a flicker of gratitude, the strength of it almost overwhelming. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. We take the fight to him, he said. We find Vareth, and we end this. Once and for all. Carter's eyes widened, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded, reaching for his weapon. Lead the way. They moved through the jungle together, each step bringing them closer to the final confrontation. Elias's mind raced, his body fueled by adrenaline and a single, burning purpose. He knew it was a suicide mission, knew that the odds were stacked against them. But he didn't care. He'd come too far to turn back now. The jungle began to thin, the ground sloping upward. Elias could see the faint glow of lights in the distance, could hear the low hum of engines. Vareth was there, waiting for him. He could feel it in his bones, a primal certainty that pulled him forward like a magnet. They reached the crest of the hill, crouching low behind a cluster of rocks. Below them, the Zavrani's base sprawled out, a web of steel and concrete against the dark jungle backdrop. Elias scanned the perimeter, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the sentries patrolling the outer fence. We'll never get through without triggering an alarm, Carter murmured, his voice tense. Elias nodded, his mind racing. We don't have to get through, he said. We just have to get Varetha's attention. How? Elias's lips twisted into a grim smile. Like this. He stood up, raising his arms above his head, and shouted into the darkness, his voice echoing across the clearing.